The daycare teacher said my husband picked our daughter up early twice a week. I just found out what he was doing with her. I stared at her in total confusion because he never got home with our daughter before 5:30. Are you sure? I asked. The teacher pulled out her attendance log and showed me 8 weeks of pickups I knew nothing about. I left the daycare and sat in my car Googling Chris's office number, calling his department directly. His coworker laughed when I asked for Chris, saying he'd only worked mornings on Tuesdays and Thursdays for months. I called in sick to work and drove home and searched through his things, finding receipts from stores I didn't recognize, charges at restaurants during times he was supposedly at work, Tuesday lunch at Chuck E. Cheese, Thursday afternoon at Build-A-Bear, places you take a child. Sophie had been singing this song lately about Mama Jess and baby brother that I'd thought was from cartoons. I recognized the street name from Chris's company directory as where Jessica lived, the new marketing manager. When Chris got home, I had everything spread across the kitchen table and told him I knew about the pickups. He didn't even try to deny it, just sat down and admitted he'd been taking Sophie to Jessica's apartment twice a week for 2 months. While I thought our daughter was at daycare, she'd been at another woman's home playing house. Jessica had set up a pink bedroom just for Sophie, bought her clothes and toys, been teaching our 3-year-old to call her Mama Jess. But it was worse than an affair because Jessica was 4 months pregnant with Chris's baby. The timing made me sick because 4 months ago I was in the middle of IVF treatments that we'd spent $20,000 on. He'd watched me inject myself with hormones every morning, held my hand through the egg retrievals, comforted me through 3 failed cycles, all while his girlfriend was already pregnant. They'd been using Sophie as practice for their new family, and our daughter had been helping them decorate a nursery, picking out dinosaur wallpaper for her baby brother's room. Chris showed me photos on his phone of Sophie at Jessica's apartment, eating lunch Jessica made, napping in the pink bed, playing with toys I'd never seen. 32 days over 2 months where my daughter was bonding with my replacement while I worked to support us. They'd enrolled Sophie in a Montessori school near Jessica's apartment without telling me, had toured it together like a real family. Jessica's lease was up next month, and they'd already put an offer on a house with a room for Sophie, a nursery for the baby, and a master bedroom for them. Sophie asked if she could live there. Chris said, she wants to be with the baby. The cruelty of turning my daughter against me by giving her a sibling through another woman was breathtaking. While I'd been crying over negative pregnancy tests, Jessica was taking Sophie to her prenatal appointments, letting her hear the baby's heartbeat, making her an accomplice in this betrayal. Chris pulled out a folder with emails to a divorce lawyer from 3 weeks ago, where he'd been asking about custody and establishing Jessica as an existing caregiver. The Tuesday-Thursday pattern wasn't random, but strategic documentation for court. Every pickup had been logged, every receipt saved, every photo time-stamped to show Jessica as a consistent maternal presence in Sophie's life. She's a better mother than you, Chris said flatly. Sophie doesn't have tantrums with her, actually eats vegetables, goes to bed without crying. Every normal parenting struggle I'd ever had was being weaponized against me. My own mother had known for a month because Chris had needed someone to help with pickups when he had real meetings. She'd been dropping Sophie at Jessica's apartment, had met the woman replacing me, had seen the nursery being built for the grandchild that wasn't mine. Your mom agrees this is best, Chris said. Sophie needs stability. 2 parents, a sibling, not whatever this is. He gestured around our small rental house like it was proof of my failure. The papers I'd signed last month thinking they were for his insurance had actually been removing me from our car loans, our joint accounts, everything except the credit card debt. They'd planned this takeover of my life so carefully that Sophie now cried when she had to leave Jessica's house, asked when she could go back to the pink room, wanted Mama Jess to read her bedtime stories instead of me. I told him he couldn't just steal our daughter, but we both knew he'd already been doing exactly that for months. Chris grabbed his keys and headed for the door, announcing he was staying at Jessica's tonight. Sophie's coming with me, he said casually. I just told your mom the jig's up, so she said she'll pick her up and bring her by Jessica's. My own mother was helping him, was in on this betrayal, delivering my daughter to another woman's arms. She agrees that Jessica's more stable, Chris said at the door. Sophie needs a real family with 2 parents and a sibling, not a broke single mother. Jessica's moving in next week. You should start looking for an apartment. I stood there frozen as he walked out with his overnight bag, and through the window I watched him throw Sophie's favorite stuffed dinosaur into his car, the purple one she couldn't sleep without. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold my phone as it hit me that he was really taking her tonight, and my own mother was driving over right now to help him do it. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts looking for that lawyer my coworker Sarah mentioned last month when her sister went through her divorce. Serena Ashworth picked up even though it was after 8, and when I explained what was happening right now, she told me to document everything with photos and notes. She said to record anything I could legally record and write down every single thing Chris had admitted tonight while it was still fresh. I started taking pictures of everything Chris had left spread across the kitchen table, all his evidence of taking Sophie to Jessica's, the receipts and logs and emails to his divorce lawyer. My hands were still shaking, but I forced myself to photograph every page, every receipt, making sure the dates and times were clear. Then I heard my mother's car in the driveway, and she walked in without knocking like she owned the place. Avoiding eye contact as she headed straight for Sophie's room, I followed her with my phone recording, watching her pack Sophie's overnight bag with clothes and toys like this was totally normal. When I asked her how she could do this to me, she just kept packing and said Jessica was more stable, and it was what's best for Sophie. She said I was too stressed from work and the failed IVF to be a good mother right now, that Sophie needed consistency and 2 parents who weren't fighting all the time. Sophie came out of her room confused and scared, rubbing her eyes and asking why Grandma was packing her things in the middle of bedtime. My mother told her she was having a special sleepover at Daddy and Mama Jess's new house, and I had to bite my tongue hard to keep from screaming the truth about what was really happening. Sophie started crying that she wanted to stay with me, reaching for me, but my mother picked her up and carried her toward the door saying Daddy was waiting. I followed them outside trying to comfort Sophie without making things worse, telling her I loved her and would see her soon, even though I had no idea when Chris would let me see her again. After they drove away with Sophie crying for me in the back seat, pressing her little face against the window, I went back inside and photographed everything Chris had left on the table again from different angles. I opened my laptop and created a new document, typing out every single detail I could remember about the past 2 months while the betrayal was still burning fresh in my mind. I wrote about the Tuesday-Thursday pattern, the daycare pickups I never knew about, Chris only working mornings, my mother helping him, Jessica's pregnancy timing with our IVF treatments. I documented Sophie's songs about Mama Jess and baby brother, the pink bedroom, the Montessori school enrollment, the house they'd put an offer on, everything Chris had thrown in my face tonight. I stayed up all night organizing everything into folders on my computer, scanning the receipts, organizing the daycare logs, saving the screenshots I'd managed to grab from Chris's phone before he left. I made folders for each week, cross-referencing dates with my work calendar to show I'd been at the office while Chris was taking Sophie to Jessica's apartment. By morning, I had a comprehensive file showing exactly how they'd planned this whole thing, how systematic and deliberate their plan to steal my daughter had been. At 7 sharp, I was standing outside the bank when they unlocked the doors and I went straight to a teller to move my direct deposit to a new account only I could access. The teller looked concerned when I explained I needed to protect my paycheck from my husband, but she helped me set up the new account and transfer everything except the minimum to keep the joint account open. She showed me how to remove Chris's access to any new accounts and helped me update my work's direct deposit information right there at her desk. Then I sat in my car and called the daycare, asking to speak with the director about adding security to Sophie's file. I added a password that had to be given before any changes could be made, specifically removing Chris's ability to change anything without my consent. The director told me Chris had actually tried to withdraw Sophie completely last month, but couldn't because he needed both parents' signatures for that. She said she'd been wondering why Chris had been asking about their withdrawal policies, and now it made sense, and she promised to document everything for me. At 9, I was sitting in Serena's office going through everything while she took notes and asked questions about specific dates and times. I wonder what Chris was thinking during those months of planning. Did he really believe Sophie would just forget about her actual mother? The way he documented everything so carefully while watching his wife go through IVF treatments makes me curious about when exactly he decided this was his plan. We spent 3 hours going through every single piece of evidence, with Serena explaining that Chris's own documentation actually helped us because it showed deliberate deception. She said judges really don't like it when one parent makes major decisions about a child's care without telling the other parent, especially when it involves another adult the child is calling mama. She explained that establishing Jessica as a caregiver without my knowledge or consent was actually a form of parental alienation, and the fact that they'd enrolled Sophie in a different school showed they were planning to cut me out completely. We worked together drafting an emergency motion for temporary custody orders, emphasizing how Chris had unilaterally made huge decisions about Sophie's care without my knowledge or consent for 2 whole months. Serena said we needed to file immediately before Chris could establish Jessica's house as Sophie's primary residence, because once that happened, it would be much harder to get her back. Right then, my phone buzzed with an email from Mike Barkley at Chris's office, and I opened it while Serena was still organizing papers. Mike had responded to my earlier message with the exact confirmation I needed, forwarding me the official schedule change form Chris had submitted 4 months ago, requesting to work only Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The form showed Chris's signature and his manager's approval stamp dated back when I was starting my second round of IVF shots. Serena grabbed the phone from my hand and immediately printed 3 copies of the email, highlighting the dates and adding it to our evidence folder. She told me to call my mother right now while we had momentum and handed me her office phone, explaining that our state allowed single-party consent for recording conversations. My hands shook as I dialed my mother's number, and Serena pressed the record button on her computer when my mother picked up. I kept my voice steady and asked her directly how long she'd been helping Chris take Sophie to Jessica's apartment. My mother sighed and admitted she'd been doing it for a month because she thought I was too stressed from work and the IVF treatments to be a good mother right now. She actually said Jessica seemed more stable and that Sophie was happier there with the pink bedroom and all the new toys. I asked her if she thought it was okay to lie to me about where my daughter was, and she said sometimes people need help even when they don't know it. Serena was typing notes as my mother kept talking, explaining how Jessica had everything organized, and Sophie never cried there like she did at home with me. When I hung up, Serena saved the recording and made backup copies on 2 different drives, saying this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to show bias and deception. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, so I opened my laptop and started creating a detailed spreadsheet of every single time I could remember Chris lying about where he was. I went through my calendar, my texts, my bank statements, matching dates and times with what Chris had told me versus what I now knew was true. The pattern went back way further than 2 months because I found restaurant charges from 6 months ago when Jessica first started at his company. There were afternoon coffee purchases near her apartment when he was supposedly in meetings, weekend hardware store trips when we didn't do any home projects, movie tickets for 2 when he said he was working late. By 4 in the morning, I had 63 instances documented with dates, times, and evidence, and the pattern was so clear it made me sick. Monday morning, Serena met me at the courthouse at 8 sharp, and we filed the emergency motion with a clerk who stamped it and gave us a case number. The clerk said we'd get a hearing date within the week and handed us the paperwork showing Chris would be served within 24 hours. Serena warned me that once Chris got served, he would probably retaliate and try to make things worse, so I needed to stay calm no matter what he did or said. She gave me her cell number and told me to document everything, but not engage with him directly, just forward everything to her. That afternoon, Brianna Ashby from the daycare called to say she'd completed the sworn statement Serena had requested about the pickup patterns. She was faxing over copies of the attendance logs showing exactly when Chris picked up Sophie versus when he'd told me she was at daycare, and she'd highlighted all the discrepancies in yellow marker. Brianna also included notes about Chris's attempts to change Sophie's enrollment without my permission and how he'd asked about withdrawal policies multiple times. She said she'd been keeping detailed notes because something had seemed off about the whole situation, and now she understood why. Friday came, and it was my first scheduled visitation with Sophie since Chris had taken her to Jessica's house. When I picked her up at the daycare, she immediately asked where Mama Jess was and when she could go back to see the baby's room. She kept talking about the dinosaur wallpaper and the new toys and asking if we could go there instead of going home. I stayed calm and redirected her to the playground, pushing her on the swings while my heart broke into pieces listening to her talk about Jessica's pancakes and the pink bed. Sophie asked 3 more times during our afternoon together when she could see the baby, and I just kept saying maybe later and changing the subject. Monday, I had my first therapy session with Dennis Barnard, and I completely fell apart in his office talking about the IVF failures. I told him about the $20,000 we'd spent, the daily hormone injections, the 3 failed cycles, all while Chris was already getting Jessica pregnant. Dennis handed me tissues as I sobbed about the cruelty of it, how Chris had held my hand during the egg retrievals and comforted me after each negative test knowing his girlfriend was carrying his baby. He helped me understand that this level of deception wasn't my fault, and that my rage was completely justified. He gave me breathing exercises to use when the anger felt overwhelming, and scheduled me for twice weekly sessions to help me process everything. Meanwhile, Serena was filing additional documentation with the court about Chris hiding assets and making financial decisions without my knowledge. She submitted copies of the insurance papers I'd signed thinking they were routine updates, but were actually removing me from our car loans and joint accounts. She showed the pattern of deception went beyond just the affair and custody issues to include financial manipulation designed to leave me with nothing but debt. At work, I finally had to tell my boss why I needed time off for court hearings because I couldn't keep calling in sick. She called me into her office and I explained the basics of what was happening with Chris and Sophie. To my surprise, she was incredibly supportive, immediately offering to let me work from home when needed and adjust my schedule around court dates. She told me she'd gone through something similar 5 years ago and knew how impossible it was to focus on spreadsheets when your whole life was falling apart. She even gave me the name of her lawyer in case I needed a second opinion and told me to take whatever time I needed. By Thursday, Chris started his retaliation campaign by sending emails with photos of Sophie at Jessica's house, showing her playing in the pink bedroom and eating dinner at Jessica's table. Each email had captions about how happy Sophie looked and how she'd asked to stay there instead of coming home with me. Serena reviewed each one and helped me write neutral responses that just said received without engaging in his obvious attempts to make me angry. She explained that judges could see through this kind of manipulation, and it would actually help our case to show his pattern of provocation. I forwarded everything to Serena, and she added it to our growing file of evidence showing Chris's attempts to alienate Sophie from me and provoke me into an emotional response that he could use against me in court. Serena called Monday morning saying the mediation was set for next week, and we needed to prep hard because Chris would try to paint me as unstable. She had me come to her office that afternoon where we spent 3 hours going over every possible question they might ask. She told me Jessica would definitely be there to intimidate me, probably wearing something that showed off her pregnant belly to remind everyone she was giving Sophie a sibling. I had to practice staying calm when they called Sophie our daughter and not correcting them when Jessica acted like Sophie's mother. Serena made me repeat facts without emotion over and over until I could say them without my voice shaking. Meanwhile, I spent every evening that week looking at apartments because Chris kept texting that I needed to be out by the end of the month. The first place I toured was in a rough neighborhood with broken glass in the parking lot and police sirens going off while the landlord showed me around. The second apartment had mold in the bathroom and bars on the windows, but it was all I could afford on my salary alone. The third place was 40 minutes from Sophie's daycare, which would mean waking her up at 5 in the morning just to get her there on time. The fourth apartment was above a bar, and the music was so loud during the tour I couldn't hear the property manager talking. By Friday, I finally found a small studio that was clean and safe and still in Sophie's school district. It was tiny, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but the landlord said kids were allowed and it was month to month so I could move if I found something better. I signed the lease that day, even though it meant Sophie would have to sleep on a pull-out couch when she stayed with me. Something about Serena's confidence makes me wonder. She's acting like this is all wrapped up already, but custody battles are messy. The way she keeps saying Chris is helping their case feels too neat. Wednesday's mediation was exactly what Serena warned me about. Jessica sat right next to Chris with her hand on her belly the whole time, wearing a tight dress that made her pregnancy super obvious. They came in holding hands and Chris pulled out her chair like they were some perfect couple. When the mediator asked about custody arrangements, Jessica actually spoke up, saying she'd been Sophie's primary caregiver for months. She called herself Sophie's real mother and said I was just the biological parent who couldn't provide stability. I wrote down every word on the legal pad Serena gave me instead of screaming that she'd stolen my daughter. Chris showed photos of Sophie's pink bedroom at Jessica's apartment and talked about the nursery they were building for the baby. He said Sophie was excited about being a big sister and had helped pick out the crib. The mediator asked about my living situation, and I had to admit I was moving to a studio apartment while Chris described their new 4-bedroom house with a backyard and swing set. When they suggested I should only have supervised visits, Serena finally spoke up with our documentation showing Chris's deception and financial manipulation. The emergency hearing happened 2 days later, way faster than we expected. The judge was an older woman who looked annoyed from the start, especially when Chris's lawyer tried to argue that I was being vindictive. She reviewed our emergency motion while we sat there in silence for what felt like forever. Then she looked directly at Chris and asked why he'd been making major decisions about Sophie without informing me. His lawyer tried to spin it as him being the more involved parent, but the judge cut him off. She ordered that Chris couldn't change Sophie's school or daycare without my written consent and set up a temporary schedule giving me Sophie Thursday through Sunday. She also ordered that all exchanges had to happen at the daycare with no direct contact between Chris and me. Jessica actually gasped when the judge said she wasn't allowed at the exchanges. Best of all, the judge appointed someone called a guardian ad litem to figure out what was actually best for Sophie instead of just listening to Chris's lies. Her name was Gabrielle Appel, and she'd be interviewing everyone and making recommendations to the court. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone might actually see the truth instead of just believing Chris's story about me being an unfit mother. Gabrielle called me the next Monday to set up our first interview. She came to my new studio apartment and I showed her everything. The timeline I'd created, all the receipts and documentation, the emails showing Chris's deception. She took notes about everything, especially the fact that Sophie had been taken to Jessica's apartment for 2 months without my knowledge. She asked about Sophie's behavior changes, and I told her about the accidents and nightmares and how Sophie kept asking for Mama Jess. Gabrielle wrote it all down without judgment, just asking follow-up questions to understand the full picture. She spent 2 hours with me and said she'd be observing Sophie during exchanges and interviewing Chris and Jessica next. When Gabrielle interviewed them, according to what she told me later, they gave her a full tour of the pink bedroom and nursery, but she asked pointed questions they weren't ready for, like why they hadn't included me in decisions about Sophie's education, and why they thought it was appropriate to have Sophie call Jessica Mama. She told me Chris got defensive when she asked about the financial papers he'd tricked me into signing. 2 weeks later, my mother showed up at daycare during my pickup time, trying to take Sophie. The daycare director called me confused because my mother was insisting Chris had sent her. I drove there immediately and found my mother arguing with the staff that she had a right to take her granddaughter. I had to call the police to document it